You think you know the measure of a person by the way they smile at a duke. But if you want the truth, look at how they treat the maid holding the tea tray. One woman did exactly that, and it brought a greedy family to its knees. Constance, the Dowager Duchess of Aylesbury, did not believe in love. She believed in alliances. She believed in property, in quiet respect, and in the ironclad security of a well-negotiated contract. Her son, Lucas, unfortunately, believed in poetry. He was 24, the newly elevated Duke of Aylesbury, and entirely too gentle for the title. He possessed a staggering fortune, a kind heart, and a slight limp from a childhood fall that made him self-conscious in the ballrooms of London. For 2 years, he had deflected the aggressive maneuvers of ambitious mothers and their polished daughters. Then he met Josephine Trent. Josephine was the daughter of a minor, financially ruined baron. To Lucas, she was an angel who looked past his limp and saw his soul. To Constance, she was a math equation that didn't add up. "She is perfect, mother," Lucas had said, pacing the length of the Aylesbury library a week before. "She doesn't care about the title. She prefers the country. She reads Wordsworth." Constance had merely sipped her tea. "A penniless girl who does not care for titles is a girl who lies very well, Lucas." They had fought. It ended with Lucas storming out and riding ahead to Oakhaven, the Trent family estate in Hampshire, to prepare for the wedding. Constance was meant to follow 3 days later in the grand ducal carriage, announced by outriders and heralded by the pomp required of her station. Instead, she stopped her carriage at a grim little posting inn, 5 miles from Oakhaven. "Your Grace," Martha, her lady's maid of 20 years, stared at her as if she had gone mad. "Take off the gray wool, Martha," Constance said, her voice brooking no argument. "And the apron. Give me the boots as well." "The boots, Your Grace. They are cobbled for a peasant. They will blister your heels." That is the point. It took 20 minutes to strip away the silk and lace of a duchess and replace it with the coarse, heavy linen of a scullery maid. The wool scratched violently against Constance's collarbone. The boots were stiff, smelling of beeswax and damp earth. She wrapped a drab brown shawl around her shoulders, covering the elegant sweep of her neck, and pinned her silver-streaked hair beneath a stark white cap. She looked at herself in the warped glass of the inn's mirror. The Duchess of Aylesbury was gone. In her place stood an aging, anonymous laborer. "Wait here with the men," Constance ordered. "If I do not send for you by tomorrow evening, bring the carriage to the estate. Do not speak of this." She walked the remaining 5 miles. It was mid-November. The Hampshire wind was merciless, carrying the bitter promise of sleet. The mud on the country road was thick and glutinous. It sucked at the soles of her borrowed boots, dragging her down with every step. Constance's legs, accustomed to padded carriages and smooth marble floors, began to burn. The cold seeped through the thin wool of her shawl, settling deep into the marrow of her bones. A carriage sped past her at one point, spraying dirty water against her skirts. The driver did not even shout a warning. Why would he? She was nothing. She was part of the scenery. By the time the iron gates of Oakhaven appeared, Constance was shivering, her hands raw and red, her hem heavy with wet dirt. Oakhaven was a tragedy of architecture. From a mile away, it held the silhouette of a grand manor. Up close, it was rotting. The stone lions at the gate were chipped. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, the gravel sparse. The paint on the window frames was peeling in long, sad strips. This was not a family living in quiet, rustic peace. This was a family bleeding to death, desperate for a tourniquet. And Lucas was the tourniquet. Constance bypassed the grand front steps and walked around to the rear courtyard. It was chaotic. Servants were rushing back and forth, carrying crates of wine, plucking chickens, scrubbing pots. The impending arrival of a duke and a wedding had thrown the understaffed household into a frenzy. She stepped through the heavy oak door into the kitchen. The heat hit her like a physical blow, thick with the smell of boiling onions and wood smoke. A large woman with a flushed face and a stained apron rounded on her immediately. "Who are you?" Constance lowered her eyes, a gesture she had never practiced in her life. "I heard you needed extra hands. From the village." The housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, didn't even ask for a name. She looked at Constance's dirt-stained hem, her weathered but clean hands, and shoved a heavy iron bucket toward her. "You're late. The Duke is already installed in the East Wing and the Dowager arrives tomorrow. If this house isn't spotless, Lady Trent will have our hides. Take this water, scrub the hearth in the secondary parlor, then fetch coal for the drawing room. Move." Constance gripped the handle of the bucket. It was agonizingly heavy. The iron bit into her palms. She did not say a word. She just nodded, turned, and carried the water into the bowels of the house. For 4 hours Constance scrubbed. She learned very quickly that to be a servant was to be invisible, yet constantly in the way. She scrubbed the soot-stained bricks of the secondary parlor hearth until her knuckles bled. Her knees, already stiff from age, and the damp cold, throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Dust coated her throat. No one looked at her face. They only looked at her hands to see if they were moving fast enough. It was a profound and terrifying loss of self. When she was the Duchess, her silence was interpreted as profound wisdom. Here, her silence was merely the expected dumbness of a beast of burden. By late afternoon, her back felt as though it had been beaten with a rod. Mrs. Higgins thrust a heavy brass scuttle filled with coal into her arms. "The drawing room. Lady Trent and Miss Josephine are in there. Mind you don't speak. Don't look them in the eye. And for God's sake, don't drop the tongs like the last idiot." Constance carried the coal down the long, drafty corridor. The drawing room door was slightly ajar. She nudged it open with her hip and slipped inside. The room was grander than the rest of the house, clearly the only space where the Trents spent their remaining coin to keep up appearances. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the gray light. A fire was dying in the grate. Lady Trent sat on a chaise, fiercely stabbing a needle into a hoop of embroidery. She was a thin, severe woman whose face seemed permanently pulled tight in a grimace of calculation. On the sofa, lounging in a pool of pale blue silk, was Josephine, Lucas's angel. Up close, without the candlelight of a London ballroom, Josephine's beauty was sharp. Her eyes were not the soft, soulful blue Lucas had described, but pale and flat like winter ice. She was eating a peach, letting the juice run over her fingers before lazily wiping it on a linen napkin. Constance knelt by the fireplace, keeping her back to them. She picked up the iron tongs and began to arrange the coals. The metal scraped lightly against the stone. "Must you make that infernal noise?" Josephine snapped. Constance froze, her breath catching in her throat. She bowed her head lower, murmuring a ragged, "Apologies, miss." "Do it quietly, stupid cow," Josephine muttered, taking another bite of the peach. She turned her attention back to her mother. "He wept again last night, mother." Lady Trent didn't look up from her needlework. "Lucas? Over what?" "A dead bird he found on the terrace." Josephine rolled her eyes, a gesture so utterly devoid of warmth that made Constance's stomach turn. "He held it in his hands and gave me a 10-minute lecture on the fragility of life. It was exhausting. I had to force myself to produce a tear just to get him to stop talking." "You will produce as many tears as he requires, Josephine," Lady Trent said sharply. "He is a duke. He is the Duke of Aylesbury. You will weep over every dead bird in Hampshire if it gets that ring on your finger." I know," Josephine sighed, leaning back. "It is just his limp. The way he drags his foot when he walks. It is humiliating. And his poetry. He read me a sonnet he wrote about my hair. It didn't even rhyme properly. I wanted to scream." By the fire, Constance's hands were shaking so violently she had gripped the iron tongs with both hands to keep them from clattering against the grate. "He is soft. He is kind," she thought, a fierce maternal rage lighting up her chest. "He thinks you are his salvation. His limp," Lady Trent said coldly, "is his greatest asset. It makes him insecure. A handsome, arrogant duke would never have looked twice at a girl with a dowry of dust and a brother facing debtor's prison. His weakness is your ladder. Climb it." "Thomas is an idiot for gambling away what little we had," Josephine said, her voice dropping into a sneer. "But Lucas will pay it. I've already laid the groundwork. I told him how Thomas is a victim of bad company. Lucas's heart bled all over the Persian rug. He practically offered to cover the debts yesterday." "Good." The sound of the needle-piercing fabric was loud in the quiet room. "And what of the dowager?" Constance held her breath. She carefully placed a black lump of coal onto the dying embers. "The Duchess," Josephine scoffed. "Lucas is terrified of her, but he is too polite to banish her. I am not." "Ah, she is a shrewd woman, Josephine. Do not underestimate Constance." "She is an old woman clutching at relevance," Josephine countered, dropping the peach pit onto a silver tray with a clatter. "Once I am his wife, I will slowly cut the strings. I will tell Lucas she is cruel to me. I will manufacture a few slights, weep into his chest, and tell him I cannot bear to live under the same roof. He is so desperate to protect me, he will exile her himself." "To where?" "There is a crumbling dower house in Cornwall. Let her rot by the sea. The salt air will finish off her joints in a year or two." Josephine laughed. It was a high, thin, terrible sound. "Then I will have Aylesbury House in London entirely to myself. Lucas can stay in the country with his poetry and his dead birds." Constance stared into the fire. The flames licked up the side of the fresh coal, burning bright and violent. She did not feel the ache in her knees anymore. She did not feel the cold. She felt only a cold, absolute clarity. She finished tending the fire, stood up, and backed away. "Wait," Lady Trent commanded. Constance stopped, keeping her head bowed. "Take that tray away. The smell of peaches gives me a headache." Constance walked over to the sofa. She picked up the silver tray. As she did, Josephine shifted, brushing her silk slipper against Constance's dirt-caked boot. Josephine recoiled as if she had been burned. "Revolting," she hissed, pulling her skirt away. "Are you incapable of watching where you stand? Get out of my sight before I have Mrs. Higgins box your ears." Constance did not look up. She did not speak. She simply took the tray, bowed her head, and walked out of the room. Once in the hallway, she leaned against the cold stone wall, squeezing her eyes shut. Her chest heaved. The sheer, unvarnished malice of it was breathtaking. They didn't just want Lucas's money. They despised him for the very kindness that made him an easy target. They viewed his gentle nature as a defect to be exploited. "You will not touch him," Constance vowed to the empty corridor. "You will not have a single penny of his fortune, and you will not break his heart. I will break yours first." The following afternoon was a symphony of orchestrated panic. The Dowager Duchess's carriage was expected within the hour. Mrs. Higgins was shouting at a pitch that rattled the kitchen windows. Floors were being swept for the 4th time. Silver was polished until it gleamed like mirrors. Constance was given the task of cleaning the glassware, banished to the back of the pantry because Mrs. Higgins deemed her too filthy to be seen in the main halls. But Constance had other plans. She stripped off the stained apron, though she kept the plain dress and the cap. She washed her face and hands in a basin of freezing water. The dirt was gone, revealing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw and the piercing gray of her eyes. It didn't matter. In this house, wearing these clothes, she was invisible. She timed it perfectly. The heavy crunch of gravel signaled Lucas's return from his morning ride across the estate. A moment later, the distinct, uneven footfalls of her son echoed in the grand foyer. Constance stepped out of the pantry and slipped into the line of servants carrying afternoon tea toward the main drawing room. She took a silver tray bearing 2 crystal glasses of sherry from a terrified-looking footman, ignoring his whispered protest, and walked through the double doors. The room was bathed in pale afternoon light. Lucas stood by the fireplace, still in his riding coat. He looked flushed, happy, and heartbreakingly open. His dark hair was wind-blown, and his eyes were fixed entirely on Josephine. The transformation in the girl was staggering. The cold, flat-eyed woman from the day before was gone. In her place stood a creature of perfect, demure grace. Josephine wore a dress of soft blush pink. Her hair was arranged to look effortlessly loose. She stood with her hands clasped delicately in front of her, gazing up at Lucas with an expression of such manufactured adoration that Constance nearly dropped the tray. Lady Trent sat nearby, wearing a maternal, approving smile that looked painful on her rigid face. "You rode to the ridge?" Josephine was saying, her voice a soft, breathless purr. "Oh, Lucas, you must be careful. The rocks there are so treacherous. If anything were to happen to you, I do not think I could bear it." She reached out, touching his arm with trembling fingers. Lucas's face softened completely. He covered her hand with his own. "I am perfectly safe, Josie. The horse is sure-footed, and I was thinking of you the entire time." "Were you?" she whispered, lowering her eyelashes. "I was. I composed something. A few lines. I'll write them down for you tonight." Josephine's smile did not waver. Not a muscle twitched to betray the disgust she had voiced only 24 hours ago. "I shall treasure it. I read your last poem until the paper was worn soft. It is my greatest comfort." Lady Trent coughed politely into a lace handkerchief. "My Lord Duke, we are expecting your mother, the Dowager, within the hour. Has she sent word of her exact arrival?" Lucas's smile dimmed slightly. He looked down, a shadow of anxiety crossing his features. "She should be here soon. I must ask you both to be patient with her. My mother is a formidable woman. She does not yield easily. But once she sees how happy you make me, Josie, I know she will love you as I do." "I am sure of it," Josephine said softly. She stepped closer to him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. Lucas wrapped an arm around her, kissing the top of her hair. "I am so anxious to meet her," Josephine continued, her voice dripping with reverence. "To finally have a mother figure, someone to guide me. I have prayed every night for her good health, Lucas. Truly, I have." Constance had heard enough. The blood roared in her ears. The restraint that had governed her entire life, the aristocratic poise, the quiet diplomacy, evaporated. She was not a duchess playing politics. She was a mother watching a predator bare its teeth at her child. She stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. Her boots made a heavy, unrefined thud against the polished hardwood floor. She bypassed the side tables, where a servant was meant to leave the tray. Instead, she walked directly to the center of the room, straight toward the couple. Lady Trent saw her first. The older woman's eyes flared with outrage. "What are you doing?" she snapped, abandoning her maternal facade. "You ignorant girl, step back. Mrs. Higgins will have you whipped." Constance ignored her. She stopped 3 feet from Lucas and Josephine. She looked down at the silver tray in her hands, then, intentionally, deliberately, let her grip loosen. The tray hit the floor with a deafening crash. Crystal shattered, spraying sherry and glass across the toes of Josephine's silk slippers. Josephine shrieked, leaping backward. "You clumsy, wretched cow!" she screamed, her mask slipping violently. "Look what you've done. I told you yesterday to stay out of my sight." Lucas stepped in front of Josephine to shield her from the glass. He turned to the servant, his face full of gentle reprimand. "It is all right, just—" Lucas stopped. He froze. The reprimand died on his lips. His eyes scanned the muddy boots, the coarse brown skirt, the drab shawl, and finally locked onto the face beneath the white cotton cap. The color drained entirely from Lucas's face. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. He looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "Lucas," Constance said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling, unmistakable authority of the Dowager Duchess of Aylesbury. It was a voice that commanded drawing rooms, silenced lords, and terrified politicians. Lady Trent stood up, her face purple with rage. "How dare you speak to the Duke in such a manner? Guards, get this filth out of my house." Constance did not look at Lady Trent. She kept her eyes locked on her son. She reached up and pulled the white cotton cap from her head. Her silver-streaked hair tumbled down. "She hasn't prayed for my health, Lucas," Constance said, her voice echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. "She plans to send me to Cornwall to rot by the sea. Because as she told her mother yesterday, you are soft, you limp like a wounded duck, and your poetry makes her want to scream." Josephine's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the servant. Recognition, horror, and absolute ruin dawned in her pale eyes all at once. "Mother," Lucas whispered. The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Mother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. The kind of silence that precedes a bridge collapsing under too much weight. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The spilled sherry pooled on the faded Persian rug, bleeding into the wool like a dark, ugly stain. Lady Trent's mouth opened and closed. Her brain, usually so adept at calculating odds and margins, completely misfired. She looked at the woman in the mud-caked boots, then at the Duke, and then back again. "Lucas, this is madness," Lady Trent choked out, her voice entirely stripped of its aristocratic polish. This creature is a vagrant, a village idiot. She has broken into my home and insulted." "Be quiet," Lucas said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The gentleness that usually warmed his voice was gone, replaced by a flat, hollow tone that commanded absolute obedience. He did not look at Lady Trent. He did not look at his mother. His eyes were locked on Josephine. Josephine was trembling. The blush-pink silk of her dress fluttered against her chest with the frantic beating of her heart. The mask of the demure, adoring angel was slipping, revealing the terrified, calculating girl trapped beneath it. She looked at the woman standing before her, really looked at her this time. She saw the posture, the straight spine, the imperious, unyielding set of the jaw. It was the exact same jawline Lucas possessed. "Lucas," Josephine whispered, stepping forward, her hands outstretched in a desperate bid for the physical contact she usually used to pacify him. "Lucas, please, I do not know what this is, but it is a cruel trick. She is lying. Whoever she is lying." Constance did not move an inch. She simply looked at her son. "Yesterday afternoon," Constance said, her voice cutting through the room like a silver blade. "At roughly 3 o'clock, I was sent in to tend the fire. You were eating a peach, Miss Trent. You complained about the noise of the iron tongs, and then you complained about my son." "Lies!" Josephine shrieked, the sound sharp and ragged. "Lucas, don't listen to her." "You said he wept over a dead bird on the terrace," Constance continued, her tone relentless, factual, utterly devoid of malice. It was a recitation of a butcher's bill. "You said you had to force yourself to produce a tear to get him to stop talking. You said his poetry didn't rhyme properly and that it made you want to scream." Lucas physically flinched. The blow landed right in the center of his chest. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had carefully written out those sonnets by candlelight. "No," Josephine sobbed, tears finally spilling over her pale cheeks. But these were not the delicate, practiced tears she used to manipulate him. These were the ugly, frantic tears of a cornered animal. "Lucas, it isn't true. I love your poetry. I love you." "You called his limp humiliating," Constance said. The room went entirely still. Even Lady Trent stopped breathing. Lucas's right leg, the one that betrayed him, the one he dragged when he was tired, seemed to grow heavy. He shifted his weight off it, a small, unconscious movement of deep shame. Constance saw it. A flash of profound sorrow crossed her gray eyes, but she did not stop. She had to cut the rot out completely, or it would fester and kill him. "Your mother told you his limp was his greatest asset," Constance said, turning her terrible gaze onto Lady Trent, who shrank back against the chaise lounge as if she had been physically struck. "She said a handsome, arrogant duke would never have looked twice at a girl with a dowry of dust and a brother facing debtor's prison. She said his weakness was your ladder. And you, Miss Trent, agreed. You said once you were married you would manufacture slights against me, weep into his chest, and have him exile me to Cornwall. So you could have Aylesbury House to yourself, and leave him in the country with his dead birds." "Lucas," Josephine begged. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his riding coat, burying her face against his chest. "She hates me. The Dowager has always hated me. She is making this up to ruin us. Tell her to leave. Tell her you love me." Lucas stood perfectly still. He did not put his arms around her. He did not stroke her hair. He looked down at the top of her head. He smelled the rosewater in her hair, the scent he had written 3 stanzas about only that morning. Then he remembered the voice that had screamed, "You clumsy, wretched cow," just moments before. He had heard it himself. He had seen the sneer on her face, the raw, unfiltered disgust aimed at a servant she thought was beneath her notice. He had seen the mask slip. His mother didn't need to invent a monster. Lucas had just seen the monster with his own two eyes. Gently, firmly, Lucas reached up and took Josephine's wrists. He peeled her hands off his coat. "Don't," Josephine pleaded, her voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. "Lucas, please, my brother. The debts. You promised." "I promised to help the woman I loved," Lucas said quietly. His voice cracked just a fraction, betraying the immense, bleeding wound in his heart. "But she does not exist, does she?" Josephine stared at him. For a single, terrifying second, the calculation vanished, and a look of pure, resentful hatred flashed in her pale eyes. It was the look of a gambler who had bet everything on a rigged game and still lost. "You are a cripple," Josephine hissed, the venom finally spilling over. "You are a soft, pathetic boy playing at being a duke. You need me. Who else is going to look at you without pity?" Lucas closed his eyes. The words were a knife twisting in his ribs. But when he opened his eyes again, the insecurity that had plagued him his entire life was gone. What replaced it was a cold, quiet dignity. He was Lucas, the Duke of Aylesbury, and he had survived worse falls than this. He stepped back, dragging his right foot deliberately. He did not hide the limp. He owned it. "You are right, Miss Trent," Lucas said softly. "I am soft, but my mother is not, and her fortune, which you so desperately need, will never buy another peach for this house." He turned away from her. He looked at Constance. The Dowager Duchess stood amidst the shattered crystal, a queen in the garments of a beggar. "Are you ready to go home, Mother?" he asked. Constance nodded. "I am." "Lucas, wait!" Lady Trent lunged forward, her pride entirely abandoned. She threw herself at his feet, ignoring the glass that crunched beneath her knees. "Your Grace, please. Thomas will be ruined. We will lose Oakhaven. You cannot leave us like this. It is a misunderstanding, I swear it on my life." Lucas looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman groveling on the floor. He felt a flicker of his old, instinctual pity. But then he looked at his mother, standing in boots that had blistered her feet, wearing coarse wool that had rubbed her neck raw, all to protect him from the wolves. "Send my condolences to your son, Lady Trent," Lucas said. "Good day." He offered his arm to his mother. Constance took it. Together they walked out of the drawing room. They did not look back when Josephine began to scream. They did not have to wait long. As Lucas and Constance stepped out through the heavy front doors of Oakhaven into the biting November wind, the familiar rumble of heavy wooden wheels and the synchronized trotting of 6 matched grays echoed up the gravel drive. The grand ducal carriage of Aylesbury, bearing the family crest in gold leaf on its polished black doors, crested the hill. It was flanked by 4 outriders in full livery. Martha, the lady's maid, sat rigidly beside the driver, her face a mask of furious anxiety. The carriage rolled to a halt at the base of the crumbling steps. The footman leapt down, lowering the velvet-lined steps, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the sight of the Duke, standing arm in arm with a woman dressed as a scullery met. He quickly averted his gaze, holding the door open. Lucas helped his mother inside. The interior smelled of expensive leather, beeswax, and lavender. Constance sank into the plush velvet cushions with a heavy sigh. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last 24 hours was rapidly fading, leaving behind the aching reality of her 60-year-old bones. Lucas climbed in after her, sitting on the opposite bench. The footman shut the door, sealing them in a quiet, padded world. A moment later, the carriage lurched forward, turning around in the chaotic courtyard and heading back down the long, weed-choked driveway. Outside, the iron gates of Oakhaven faded into the mist. Behind them, a family was already sinking beneath the icy waters of financial ruin. But see, tomorrow the creditors would hear the engagement was broken. By the end of the week, the estate would be stripped. Inside the carriage there was only the rhythmic sound of hooves and the creak of the suspension. Constance leaned forward and began to unlace the heavy, mud-caked boots. Her fingers were stiff, the skin around her knuckles raw and cracked from the lye soap. She winced as she pulled the right boot off. Her heel was bleeding, a bright patch of crimson against the coarse gray wool of her stocking. Lucas watched her. He reached across the small space, gently swatting her hands away. "Let me," he said. Constance opened her mouth to protest, to maintain the ironclad composure she had worn all day, but looking at her son's face, she stopped. She let her hands fall to her lap. Lucas knelt on the floor of the carriage. He carefully unlaced the left boot, easing it off her foot as if he were handling spun glass. He pulled a clean linen handkerchief from his coat pocket and gently pressed it against her bleeding heel. "You walk 5 miles in these," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. "It was cold," Constance replied, her voice quieter now, stripped of its drawing-room authority. "You scrubbed their floors. Only the secondary parlor. Mrs. Higgins did not trust me with the good china." Lucas let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. He rested his forehead against Constance's knee, keeping the handkerchief pressed to her heel. His shoulders began to shake. He didn't wail. He didn't curse. He just cried. He cried for the poems he had written, for the future he had built in his head, and for the ugly, undeniable truth that his money was the only part of him the world seemed to value. Constance did not offer him platitudes. She did not tell him that time heals all wounds, or that there were plenty of other women in London. She knew those were lies. Instead, she placed her raw, red, un-Duchess-like hand on top of his head, weaving her fingers through his dark hair. "I am a fool," Lucas whispered into the coarse wool of her skirt. "I am a blind, stupid fool." "You are not a fool, Lucas," Constance said fiercely. "You are good. You look at a rotting house and see a home. You look at a venomous girl and see an angel. That is not stupidity. That is grace." Lucas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale. "It is weakness." She said it herself. "It makes me an easy target. If I were more like you, if I were harder, this wouldn't have happened. I should have seen it. I should have known." Constance shook her head slowly. She looked down at the muddy boots sitting on the pristine floor of the carriage. "When your father died," Constance said, her voice dropping into the quiet rhythm of memory, "I was 26 years old. I had a title, an immense fortune, and a 2-year-old son who limped. Do you know what the world saw when they looked at us?" Lucas remained silent, listening. "They saw a carcass," Constance said bluntly. "Uncles, cousins, barons, dukes, they all circled. They wanted the land, they wanted the money, they smiled at me, they brought me flowers, and behind their hands they placed bets on how quickly they could bleed us dry. I learned to be hard because I had to be. I learned to spot a liar by the way they held their teacup. I built a fortress out of ice so that nothing could ever touch us." She reached out, cupping Lucas's cheek. Her thumb brushed away a tear. "But I did not build that fortress so you would have to live in the ice with me, Lucas," she said, her voice cracking with a fierce, protective love. "I became hard so you could remain gentle. Your kindness, your poetry, the way you care for dead birds on the terrace, those are not defects. They are the best parts of you. They are the parts of your father that survived." Lucas leaned into her hand, closing his eyes. The deep, agonizing knot of humiliation in his chest began to loosen, just slightly. "The world is full of Trents, Lucas," Constance continued. "There will always be people who view your heart as a weakness to be exploited. You cannot change them, but you must never let them change you. You just require a bit of guarding from time to time." Lucas opened his eyes. He looked at his mother. He looked at the white cotton servant's cap sitting on the velvet seat beside her, the dirt under her fingernails, the blood on her heel. "I am sorry I yelled at you in the library," Lucas said softly. "I am sorry I ruined your engagement," Constance replied. A small, genuine smile touched the corner of Lucas's mouth. "The sherry was an excellent touch," though I pity whoever has to scrub that rug." Constance leaned back, a dry, cynical glimmer returning to her gray eyes. "Oh, Mrs. Higgins will make short work of it. She is remarkably efficient." The carriage rolled on, carrying them away from the mud of Hampshire and back toward the sprawling, complicated world of London. The sky outside began to clear, the bitter sleet giving way to the cold, bright light of late afternoon. Lucas climbed back onto his seat. He sat up straight. He looked out the window, watching the barren trees whip past. He was older now than he had been that morning. The naive boy who thought love was a simple, easy thing, boom, was dead. In his place sat a duke who understood the exact weight of his title and the cost of his illusions. But as he watched a solitary hawk circle in the pale winter sky, he found himself reaching into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed the folded piece of parchment where he had written his latest poem. He did not tear it up. He did not throw it out the window. He left it in his pocket. He would read it again later. Constance watched him from the opposite bench. She saw the shift in his posture, the quiet acceptance settling over his features. She closed her eyes, letting the sway of the carriage lull her into a much-needed rest. She had paid a heavy price today. Her knees ached, her hands burned, and her dignity had been left in a puddle of muddy water. But as she listened to the steady, even breathing of her son, the Dowager Duchess of Aylesbury knew it was the best bargain she had ever struck. Did the Dowager Duchess go too far, or did Lucas need a harsh reality check to survive his own kindness? Sometimes the most brutal truths are delivered by those who love us most. No, what would you have done if you saw a predator circling your child? Let us know your thoughts on Constance's brutal revenge in the comments below. If you love this deep dive into historical drama, hit that like button, share with a friend, and subscribe for more.